Hello again. I'm glad you've joined us today as we continue to study the Gospel of Mark. Today we pick up in Mark chapter 13 and verse 24. As we think about the context here, in our past lessons, Jesus has just left the temple for the last time. Matthew's account tells us that he told them, "I'll leave unto you this house desolate." As they left, thinking about those words, the disciples point out the beautiful and magnificent buildings and the stones in which they're built of. And Jesus says to them very plainly, not one stone's going to be left upon another. They then leave and go down across the valley over to the Mount of Olives, and from there Peter, James, and John, and Andrew come questioning him privately about these things and when they're going to take place. In their mind, they can't separate between this happening to Jerusalem and Israel and it not being the end of the world. Matthew's account even says, they ask, and when is the end of the age, of putting all that together. Jesus makes a separation between the two. He deals with the signs and the things as to when these things will take place concerning the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, the abomination of desolation. He makes it very plain that these things will take place, and there would be many, he warns, who would come and claiming to be a Christ, claiming to know when these things were going to take place, false prophets leading people astray. But he says, warns that wars, rumors of wars, earthquakes and famines, these are just the natural course of things, and they're just birth pangs. There's nothing to what's coming. But he says, he gives them things to look for as to when these things would come and to what they were to do. He makes it very plain that these things were going to take place, as he said, within the lifetime, or within that generation of people. And he tells them that between this time that he's speaking and when this destruction of Jerusalem and Israel as a nation takes place, that there's going to be some hard times coming for them. There's going to be persecution, especially from the Jews. Not only will they be taken before the authorities of the Gentiles, but it would be the Jews who would be instigators many times of these things, and they'd be flogged in the synagogues. And it would cause brother to rise against brother, and family members against family members, even children and parents at odds with one another. But he tells them that they would be hated on his account. But he says the one who endures, there in verse 13, he says he'll be saved. He talks about this abomination of desolation, the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple is coming, and that they, when they see it about to happen, that they're to flee to the mountains. Matthew's account says when you see the armies gathering around, they're to flee. And they're not to waste any time. If they're on the housetop, they're not to go back in the house and get anything. If they're in the field, don't go back and get your cloak. They're to flee. He says, woe to those who are with child or who are nursing. And the reason is because it's going to be that much more difficult and dangerous to flee if you're pregnant or nursing a child. Matthew's account says, pray that it might not be on the Sabbath, for that'd be a time when all the city gates will be shut, and it'd be that much harder for them to flee quickly. History tells us that those who did escape the ravages of the Romans when they came to destroy and to kill were those who fled as Jesus had warned. Jesus says again, behold, there's going to be false Christs and false prophets, but he says, don't be led astray. He said, behold, I'm telling you everything in advance. We continue in chapter 13 verse 24. He says, but in those days after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers that are in the heavens will be shaken, and they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. Then he will send forth his angels and will gather his elect from the four corners of the wind, from the farthest of ends of the earth to the farthest ends of the heavens. Persecution would continue even after the destruction of Jerusalem, and we see that God would eventually come and judgment against Rome itself. Persecution would continue even through the powers of Rome, but God would be gathering his people. And here Jesus is using very figurative prophetic language to describe this day of the Lord's judgment that's come upon Israel and eventually even upon Rome, who destroyed Israel by God's direction. He uses terms like the moon turning to blood and the Son of Man coming in the clouds. This kind of language doesn't always refer to the great and final day of the Lord. Again, Jesus already made plain that that's not what he's talking about. He goes on to talk about how that truly these things will not, he said, this generation will not pass until these things will take place. So he's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem and these things that were to come within their generation. You find the same type of language used in the prophets when they would speak of the day of the Lord's wrath that was come upon nations because of their wickedness. And he's talking about the day of the Lord's wrath that's going to come upon Israel as a result of them rejecting him. Remember, Jesus had lamented how many times God had sent the prophets. Now he sent the prophet, the Son of God, and they're rejecting him. And as a result, God would reject them as a nation. And same kind of language is used concerning Babylon, for example, in Isaiah 13, talking about the day of the Lord coming upon Babylon, or Egypt in Isaiah chapter 19, talking about the Lord coming on a cloud. It's talking about him coming in judgment. Same thing we see concerning Edom in Isaiah 34. When he says that the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light, stars will be falling. Again, we see this language in a lot of different places. We see it in Ezekiel, we see it in Joel chapter 2 and verse 30, when he talked about a display of wonders in the sky and on the earth, blood and fire and columns of smoke. The sun will be turned into darkness, the moon will be turned into blood before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. And he's not talking about the great and final day, but the day of the Lord's judgment as it comes upon a nation. The point is that when this happens to Jerusalem, it's not something that's happening that's arbitrary, but it's a due penalty carried out by God in divine judgment. And Jesus declares there in verse 30 that these things that he has just described would take place within that generation. As we said, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. And it did take place. History tells us, of course, in AD 70, the Roman forces come under the direction of Titus. And they came and completely destroyed Jerusalem and its temple after a 143-day siege of the city. And over 600,000 Jews were slain, and thousands more were led off into captivity. The destruction was so thorough that not one stone was left upon another, just as Jesus predicted. Now we pick back up in verse 28 of Mark 13, and Jesus says, learn from the parable of the fig tree. When its branches already become tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. Even so, you too, when you see these things happening, recognize that he is near, right at the door. Truly I say unto you, this generation will not pass away till all these things take place. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my word shall not pass away. Jesus is again speaking about the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, warning that it will come and that they can see the signs that it is coming. He warns them about these false predictions and false teachings that would come prior to it, but he tells them certain things to look for, and when they see it, they know that the time of destruction is near. It's right at the door, that God is coming in his judgment against Israel, and they need to be ready for it and escape the horror that would come. And here he uses the illustration of a fig tree, saying when you see it all leaved out, you know by that time that summer's near. That's a sign that summer's close. And therefore he says, when you see the things happening that I'm telling you, you can know that the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple are right at hand. Again, this is not talking about the final coming, but he's talking about what's going to take place within that generation, and it did in AD 70. He said, heaven and earth shall pass away, but my word shall not pass away. What he says is going to happen. And there will be a time when heaven and earth shall pass away. But he says in verse 32, but of that day and hour, that is, of the day, he's already told them how they can look for the coming of these things, the destruction of Jerusalem. As far as when heaven and earth shall pass away, he said, of that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. Take heed, keep on the alert, for you do not know when the appointed time will come. It's like a man away on a journey who, upon leaving his house and putting his slave in charge, assigning each of them his task, and commanded the doorkeeper to stay on the alert. Therefore, be on the alert, for you do not know when the master of the house is coming, whether it's at evening or midnight, or when the rooster crows or in the morning, in case he should come suddenly and find you asleep. What I say to you, I say to all, be on the alert. So Jesus is warned concerning the coming destruction of Jerusalem, the temple, and Israel as a nation. And he's given signs to look for concerning the time that these things would come so that they might be able to flee. And he assured them that it would be within the time frame of that generation. There will be a time when heaven and earth shall pass away. But he says in verse 32, of that day and hour, that great and final day, he says no one knows when that's going to be, not even the angels nor the Son, he says, but the Father alone. As we mentioned earlier, when the disciples asked concerning the destruction of Jerusalem, they combined their question, well, when will these things be, and when's the end of the age, as stated in Matthew 24. They couldn't separate those two things. They thought if this happened to Jerusalem and the temple and Israel, then this surely must be the end of the world. But Jesus separates the two, giving them signs for the destruction of Jerusalem, what to look for and how to prepare, and then states concerning the great and final day when heaven and earth shall pass away that no one knows when that will be but the Father alone. And he concludes by giving this parable that teaches that we just must be ready. We don't know when the Lord's going to come finally in the final day. Only the Father knows when that's going to be. But we must be on the alert. He says just like a master who leaves his servants with certain tasks to be fulfilled and tells the doorkeeper to keep on the alert and to watch. And we must be just like that, fulfilling our responsibilities and be watching and ready, being on the alert for when he comes, for we don't know when it comes. And he says we need to watch so that we won't be found asleep. We don't want to be found asleep spiritually. We want to be fulfilling our responsibilities before the Lord, not knowing when our Master is going to return, but knowing that he is going to return. And Jesus says, I'm going to say this to you, I say it to everybody, be on the alert. And such an important lesson for all of us. We'll stop there. I'm glad you joined us today. I hope you'll come back and study with us next time as we pick up in the next chapter. Until then, we bid you a good day.